The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps in Silver Creek, Texas, as townspeople gathered for the monthly orphan auction. It was 1897, and such events were common throughout the frontier territories. Children without families were placed with households that could provide work in exchange for food and shelter. The practice was seen as practical rather than cruel, though the reality often proved harsher than the intentions. 12-year-old Margaret O'Sullivan stood among 15 other children on the wooden platform that had been hastily erected in the town square. Her red hair caught the sunlight, making her stand out among the group of mostly brown-haired youngsters. She wore a faded blue dress that had been mended several times, its original color barely visible through years of washing and wear. Her green eyes darted nervously between the faces in the crowd, searching for something she couldn't quite name. The auctioneer, a portly man named Jeremiah Hawks, called for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have some fine young workers here today. These children come from the Mercy Home for Foundlings in San Antonio. Each one is healthy, willing to work, and in need of a good Christian home." Margaret had been at the Mercy Home since she was 5 years old. Her parents had died in a cholera outbreak that swept through their small farming community outside Austin. She remembered little about them except her mother's gentle hands braiding her hair each morning and her father's deep laugh echoing through their tiny cabin. The memories felt more like dreams now, fading with each passing year. The bidding began with the older boys, as they always did. 15-year-old Thomas went first, his strong frame and calloused hands evidence of his capacity for heavy labor. A wheat farmer from the next county over claimed him for $75 and a promise of fair treatment. Margaret watched as Thomas gathered his small bundle of belongings and walked away without looking back. She had shared meals with him at the orphanage, and now he was gone forever. Next came the younger boys, then the older girls. One by one, Margaret's companions from the long train journey found new homes. Some went to farmers needing help with livestock. Others were chosen by shopkeepers' wives who needed assistance with household duties. A few of the prettier girls were selected by well-dressed women who spoke of companionship and light domestic work. As the platform emptied, Margaret found herself among the last 4 children remaining. There was Samuel, a quiet 8-year-old with a withered left arm from a childhood accident. Beside him stood twin sisters, barely 6 years old, who clung to each other and spoke only in whispers. And then there was Margaret, too old to be considered cute, too young to be truly useful, and bearing the additional burden of her fiery temperament. The auctioneer's voice grew more urgent as the crowd began to thin. "Now we have young Margaret here, 12 years old, can read and write, knows her numbers, and has experience with cooking and cleaning. She's a spirited girl who just needs the right guidance." Margaret's cheeks burned with shame as Mr. Hawks listed her qualities like she was livestock at a cattle auction. She kept her chin up despite the humiliation, a habit her mother had taught her long ago. "Never let them see you broken, little one," her mother's voice whispered in her memory. A farmer with tobacco-stained teeth stepped forward. "What about her disposition? I don't want no troublemaker in my house." "She's had some difficulties adjusting to authority," Mr. Hawks admitted reluctantly, "but nothing that firm discipline can't correct." The farmer looked Margaret up and down with calculating eyes. "She's a bit scrawny, probably eat more than she's worth in work. I'll pass." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes but refused to let them fall. She had learned at the orphanage that crying only made things worse. The matrons there had little patience for displays of emotion, particularly from a girl they considered difficult due to her tendency to speak up when she witnessed injustice. An elderly woman in worn clothing approached next. Her face was kind but tired, marked by years of hard living. "How much for the girl?" $50, ma'am, and she comes with a month's trial period." The woman counted coins from a small purse, her lips moving silently as she calculated. Margaret held her breath, hoping this gentle-looking woman might offer her a chance at a real home. But after a long moment, the woman shook her head sadly. "I'm sorry, dear, I just don't have enough. I was hoping for one of the younger ones." Margaret's heart sank as the woman walked away. The crowd was dispersing now, many families having found the children they wanted. Only a handful of people remained, and their interest seemed to focus entirely on the twin sisters. Mr. Hawks tried again. "This girl has been educated by the nuns at the Mercy Home. She can keep books, write letters, and has a fine hand with needlework. Surely someone can see her value." But the remaining potential families showed little interest in a girl who was, as one woman put it, right at that difficult age. Margaret understood what they meant. She was too old to be molded easily, too young to provide the labor of an adult, and too intelligent for those who preferred their help to be unquestioning. As the afternoon wore on, the twin sisters were finally placed with a childless couple who seemed genuinely pleased to take them both. Margaret watched them go with mixed feelings, happiness that they would stay together, but growing despair at her own prospects. Only Samuel and Margaret remained on the platform now. The boy sat quietly in the corner, resigned to whatever fate awaited him. Margaret stood straight despite her exhaustion, determined not to show the fear that was growing in her chest like a cold stone. The sun was beginning to set when a woman in an expensive green dress approached the platform. She was perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair styled fashionably and jewelry that caught the dying light. Her husband, a distinguished man in a fine suit, followed at her side. "We'll take the boy," the woman announced without ceremony. "He looks manageable enough, and we need help in the kitchen garden." Mr. Hawks quickly completed the transaction, eager to place at least one more child before dark. Margaret watched as Samuel gathered his few possessions and followed his new family toward a fancy carriage waiting at the edge of the square. He turned back once to wave at Margaret, and she lifted her hand in farewell, wondering if she would ever see him again. Now Margaret stood completely alone on the platform. The square was nearly empty except for a few stragglers and the town drunk who had been sleeping off his afternoon drinking session on a nearby bench. Mr. Hawks looked at his pocket watch and frowned. "Well, girl, it seems this wasn't your day. Don't you worry, though, we'll try again next month in Millerville." The thought of another month in a strange place, followed by another humiliating display on an auction block, made Margaret's stomach turn. But before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention. A man on horseback rounded the corner of Main Street, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing practical clothes that marked him as a working rancher rather than a town dweller. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his face was weathered by years under the Texas sun. He appeared to be in his late 30s or early 40s. The rider dismounted and tied his horses to the hitching post before approaching the platform. His boots made solid sounds on the wooden boards as he climbed the steps to where Margaret stood. "I hear you're looking for homes for these children," he said to Mr. Hawks, his voice carrying a slight drawl that marked him as a native Texan. Mr. Hawks perked up immediately. "Yes, sir, Mr. Callahan, James Callahan. I have a ranch about 20 miles west of here." He turned to look at Margaret with serious brown eyes. "Just this one left." "Yes, sir, this is Margaret. She's 12, educated, and willing to work. She's had some minor behavioral issues, but nothing that proper guidance can't address." Margaret bristled at being described as having behavioral issues, but she bit her tongue. She had learned that defending herself usually only made things worse. Mr. Callahan studied her for a long moment. Margaret met his gaze steadily, determined not to look away first. Something in his expression was different from the other potential families who had looked at her that day. There was no calculation in his eyes, no assessment of her potential value as a worker. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like recognition. "What kind of behavioral issues?" he asked Mr. Hawks without taking his eyes off Margaret. "She has a tendency to speak out of turn, sir. Arguments with the matrons about punishment of the younger children, that sort of thing. She has strong opinions about fairness." To Margaret's surprise, something that might have been a smile flickered across Mr. Callahan's weathered face. "Strong opinions about fairness, you say?" He turned back to the auctioneer. "Sounds like she has good instincts to me." Mr. Hawks looked uncertain about how to respond to this unexpected reaction. "Well, sir, she's a good worker when properly motivated. The nuns gave her excellent marks in all her lessons." "Can you speak for yourself, girl?" Mr. Callahan asked Margaret directly. Margaret was so surprised by being addressed that she almost didn't respond. None of the other potential families had spoken to her directly, preferring to discuss her as if she weren't present. "Yes, sir," she said, finding her voice. "What's your full name?" "Margaret Rose O'Sullivan, sir." "Irish family?" "Yes, sir. My parents came from County Cork before I was born." "And what happened to them?" Margaret swallowed hard. "They died of cholera when I was 5, sir. That's when I went to the Mercy home." Mr. Callahan nodded slowly. I'm sorry for your loss. That's a hard thing for anyone, especially a child. The simple acknowledgement of her grief caught Margaret off guard. No one at the orphanage had ever spoken of her parents' death as anything more than an unfortunate circumstance that had led to her placement there. "Thank you, sir," she managed to say. "Tell me about these behavioral problems Mr. Hawks mentioned." Margaret glanced nervously at the auctioneer, who was clearly hoping she wouldn't say anything to discourage this potential buyer. But something in Mr. Callahan's steady gaze told her that honesty would serve her better than deception. "I spoke up when I saw unfairness, sir. When the smaller children were punished for things they didn't do, or when the older girls took their food. The matron said it wasn't my place to interfere." "And what do you think about that?" Margaret hesitated. This felt like a test, but she couldn't tell what answer he was looking for. "I think we should protect those who can't protect themselves, sir, even if it gets us in trouble." This time Mr. Callahan definitely smiled, though it was gone so quickly Margaret almost thought she had imagined it. "Mr. Hawks, what's your asking price for Margaret?" $50, sir, with a standard trial period." "I'll give you 60, and we'll skip the trial period." Mr. Hawks looked surprised but pleased. "That's very generous, Mr. Callahan. I'll get the papers ready immediately." As the men concluded their business, Margaret stood in stunned silence. After a day of rejection and humiliation, this stranger had not only chosen her, but paid extra for the privilege. She didn't understand his reasoning, but she felt a tiny spark of hope kindle in her chest. Mr. Callahan finished signing the papers and turned back to Margaret. "Do you have any belongings to collect?" "Just a small bag, sir. It's over there." She pointed to where she had left her meager possessions: a change of clothes, a worn prayer book that had belonged to her mother, and a small wooden horse her father had carved for her. Mr. Callahan retrieved the bag and handed it to her with the same courtesy he might show a grown woman. "Are you ready to go to your new home, Margaret?" Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. She followed him to where his horses waited, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. This man was a complete stranger, and she was about to ride off with him to a place 20 miles from anything familiar. Mr. Callahan helped her mount the pack horse, which was fitted with a blanket saddle for her comfort. As they rode out of town, Margaret looked back once at Silver Creek, wondering if she would ever see it again. Then she turned her face toward the setting sun and whatever lay ahead. The ride to the ranch took nearly 3 hours, following dusty trails through rolling hills dotted with oak trees and patches of wildflowers. Mr. Callahan rode slightly ahead, occasionally pointing out landmarks or mentioning details about the countryside. His voice was calm and educational rather than commanding, which surprised Margaret after her experiences with the strict authority figures at the orphanage. As darkness fell, they finally saw lights ahead. The Callahan Ranch house was a substantial 2-story structure built of native stone and timber, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Several outbuildings were visible in the moonlight: a large barn, a bunkhouse, corrals, and what appeared to be a workshop. Everything looked well-maintained and prosperous. "Welcome to the Double C Ranch," Mr. Callahan said as they dismounted. "This will be your home now, Margaret." A woman emerged from the house carrying a lantern. She was perhaps 10 years younger than Mr. Callahan, with kind blue eyes and blonde hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her dress was simple but well-made, and she moved with the confident efficiency of someone accustomed to managing a busy household. "This must be Margaret," she said warmly. "I'm Sarah Callahan. James has told me so much about you." Margaret looked between them in confusion. "But sir, you just met me today." Sarah laughed, a pleasant sound that echoed across the ranch yard. "James has been talking about bringing home a child from the orphan auction for weeks. He said he would know the right one when he saw them." This revelation made Margaret even more puzzled. Why had this man specifically sought out an orphan, and why had he chosen her when so many others had found her unsuitable? "Come inside," Sarah continued. "You must be hungry and tired after such a long day." The interior of the ranch house was more comfortable than anywhere Margaret had lived since leaving her parents' cabin. The main room featured a large stone fireplace, comfortable furniture, and shelves lined with books. Oil lamps provided warm light, and the smell of something delicious drifted from the kitchen. "I kept supper warm for you," Sarah said, leading Margaret to a dining table set with 3 places. "James thought you might arrive late." As they ate beef stew with fresh bread and butter, Margaret began to relax slightly. The Callahans spoke to each other and to her as equals, asking about her journey and sharing details about life on the ranch. There was none of the formal distance she had expected between herself and her new employers. "We have 5 full-time ranch hands," James explained. "Good men who work hard and treat everyone with respect. Sarah manages the household and we both share in the business decisions." "What will my duties be?" Margaret asked, expecting to hear about cooking, cleaning, and general labor. Sarah and James exchanged a glance before Sarah answered. "Well, that depends partly on what you'd like to do. James tells me you can read and write well. We could use help with correspondence and keeping records. And I'd enjoy having another woman around to talk with and share the household responsibilities." Margaret stared at them. "You mean I would be more like family?" "That's exactly what we mean," James said quietly. "Sarah and I have been married for 8 years, but we've never been blessed with children of our own. We've been talking for some time about providing a home for someone who needed one." "But why me?" Margaret asked. "The other families today all wanted someone different." Sarah reached across the table and touched Margaret's hand gently. "James told me what you said about protecting those who can't protect themselves. That tells us everything we need to know about your character." Margaret felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of relief rather than despair. For the first time in 7 years, she felt like she might truly have found a home. "There's just one thing," James added seriously. "We'll never ask you to call us mother and father if you don't want to. Your parents will always be your parents, but we hope that someday you'll consider us family." Margaret nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in her throat. Sarah showed her to a small but comfortable bedroom upstairs, complete with a real bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the ranch grounds. "Sleep well, dear," Sarah said from the doorway. "Tomorrow we'll show you around and help you get settled." As Margaret lay in her new bed that night, listening to the unfamiliar but comforting sounds of the ranch settling around her, she thought about the strange turns her life had taken. This morning, she had been just another unwanted orphan on an auction block. Tonight, she was lying in a real home with people who had chosen her not for her labor, but for who she was as a person. She thought about her parents and wondered what they would think of the Callahans. She hoped they would approve of this new chapter in her life. For the first time since their deaths, Margaret allowed herself to believe that her future might hold happiness as well as security. Outside her window, she could hear the gentle sounds of horses moving in the corrals and the distant call of a night bird. These would become the familiar sounds of home, she realized. And tomorrow would begin her new life as Margaret O'Sullivan Callahan, not because she had been bought and sold, but because she had been chosen and welcomed. The ranch would teach her many things in the months and years to come, about hard work and responsibility, about the land and the animals, about business and family. But the most important lesson had already begun, that her worth was not determined by what others thought of her, but by who she chose to be. And surrounded by people who saw her value, she would have the chance to become everything she was meant to be. The rooster's crow woke Margaret before dawn, just as it had every morning for the past 3 months. She no longer startled at the sound, having grown accustomed to the rhythms of ranch life. The October air carried a crisp coolness that promised winter was approaching the Texas Hill Country. She dressed quickly in the practical clothes Sarah had helped her select: sturdy boots, split riding skirt, and a warm cotton blouse that could withstand the demands of outdoor work. Downstairs, Sarah was already preparing breakfast while James checked the morning reports from the night watch. The Double C Ranch ran cattle on nearly 10,000 acres, requiring constant vigilance against predators, strays, and the occasional rustler. Margaret had learned to read the signs of ranch life: the set of James's shoulders when there was trouble, the particular way Sarah hummed when she was planning something special, the different calls the cowboys used to communicate across the vast distances. "Morning, Margaret," James said without looking up from the ledger where he tracked cattle counts and expenses. "Sleep well." "Yes, sir, thank you." She had stopped feeling awkward about the courtesy the Callahans showed her, though it still amazed her sometimes. At the Mercy home, children were expected to be grateful for basic necessities. Here, she was treated with the same respect given to any family member. "After breakfast, I'd like you to ride out to the south pasture with me," James continued. "Cookie thinks we might have lost some steers to that new wash the storm created last week. Your eyes are sharper than mine for spotting tracks." Margaret felt a surge of pride at the compliment. Over the past months, she had discovered an unexpected talent for tracking and reading sign. James had begun including her in ranch work that went far beyond the household duties she had expected. She could now ride as well as any of the cowboys, handle basic veterinary care for injured animals, and keep detailed records of ranch operations. "What about the correspondence that came in yesterday?" Margaret asked, remembering the stack of letters that had arrived with the weekly supply wagon. "After lunch," Sarah said, setting a plate of eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits in front of her. "Mrs. Henderson in town is still talking about how impressed she was with your letter writing. She says you have the finest hand she's ever seen outside of a formal school." Margaret smiled at the praise. One of her primary responsibilities had become managing correspondence for the ranch. James and Sarah could both read and write competently, but neither had received the intensive education in penmanship and composition that the nuns at Mercy Home had provided. Her letters to suppliers, potential buyers, and business associates had earned the ranch a reputation for professionalism that translated into better deals and stronger relationships. After breakfast, she joined James for the ride to the south pasture. The countryside was beautiful in the morning light, with dew still sparkling on the grass and wildflowers blooming in patches of color across the rolling hills. Margaret had come to love these quiet rides with her guardian, when they could talk without interruption about everything from ranch business to books they had read. "James," she said as they crested a low hill, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you really choose me that day? I know what you said about protecting others, but there were younger children there. Easier children." James was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Do you remember what you said when I asked you about your behavioral problems?" "I said we should protect those who can't protect themselves." "That's right, and do you know why that mattered to me?" Margaret shook her head. "Because I've seen too many people in this world who look the other way when they see injustice. They tell themselves it's not their responsibility or that speaking up won't change anything. But you were just 12 years old, and you had already learned that principle." He paused to scan the horizon before continuing. "Sarah and I lost our first baby 5 years ago. She was born too early and didn't live through the night. We had been trying to have children ever since, but it wasn't happening. We could have chosen to be bitter about it, or we could find another way to build the family we wanted." Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion. She had wondered about the sadness she sometimes saw in Sarah's eyes, the way her face softened when she looked at the children who occasionally visited the ranch with their families. "We decided that when the right child came along, we would know it. And when I saw you standing up there, refusing to be broken despite everything you had been through, I knew you were our daughter in every way that mattered." The simple declaration of belonging hit Margaret like a physical blow. In all her fantasies about finding a family, she had never dared to imagine being claimed so completely and unconditionally. "Even though I'm not your blood?" she asked quietly. "Blood doesn't make a family," James said firmly. "Love and commitment do. You chose to trust us and we chose you. That makes us family." They found the missing cattle trapped in a narrow canyon where flood waters had carved a new channel. The animals were unhurt but unable to find their way out on their own. Working together, Margaret and James managed to guide them back to the main herd. The work required patience, skill, and perfect coordination between horse and rider, abilities Margaret had developed through months of James's careful instruction. On the ride back to the house, they encountered Tom Bradley, one of the newer ranch hands who had been hired just 6 weeks earlier. Bradley was a competent worker, but Margaret had noticed that he sometimes showed less respect for James's authority than the other men. He had also made several comments about Margaret's presence on ranch business that suggested he disapproved of a young girl being involved in what he considered men's work. "Boss," Bradley called out as they approached, "got a problem with that new bull. He's been aggressive with the cowboys, and yesterday he nearly took a piece out of Miguel." James frowned. "How bad?" "Bad enough that Miguel's sporting a bruise from here to Sunday. Animal needs to be taught some respect." "What do you suggest?" Bradley's gaze shifted to Margaret before answering. "Well, normally I'd recommend a firm hand with the whip, but maybe we should discuss it privately." Margaret felt her cheeks flush with anger. Bradley was implying that she was too delicate to hear about the realities of ranch management. James seemed to sense her reaction. "Margaret is part of this operation," he said calmly. "She can hear whatever you have to say." Bradley's jaw tightened. With respect, boss, some things ain't appropriate for a young lady's ears, and some kinds of work ain't suitable for someone of her refinement. Margaret had been building toward this confrontation for weeks. Bradley's attitude represented everything she had fought against at the orphanage, the assumption that she was weak, decorative, and unsuited for important work. "Mr. Bradley," she said, keeping her voice level despite her anger, "I've helped deliver calves, treated infected wounds on horses, and tracked rustlers through terrain that would challenge most men. What exactly do you think is beyond my refinement?" Bradley's face darkened. "You've got a smart mouth for someone who was bought off an auction block 3 months ago." The insult hung in the air between them. Margaret felt as if she had been slapped, but before she could respond, James's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "That's enough, Bradley. You're fired." Bradley looked shocked. "Boss, I didn't mean nothing by it. I was just—" "You were disrespecting my daughter," James said with quiet fury. "Get your gear and be off my land within the hour." As Bradley rode away muttering under his breath, James turned to Margaret with concern in his eyes. "Are you all right?" Margaret was surprised to find that she was. The man's words had stung, but they hadn't broken her the way similar comments might have months earlier. She was no longer the desperate, unwanted child who had stood on that auction platform. She was Margaret O'Sullivan Callahan, valued member of the Double C Ranch. "I'm fine," she said, and meant it. "Thank you for standing up for me." "You don't need to thank me for that. We're family, that's what family does." That evening at dinner, Sarah brought up a subject that had been discussed several times over the past weeks. "Margaret, we've been thinking about your education. You're obviously bright, and you've learned everything we can teach you about ranch management. But there are other things you might want to learn." "What kind of things?" "Well," James said, "there's a new teacher in town, Miss Catherine Walsh. She came from back east with formal training in mathematics, literature, and science. She started a small school for the older children whose families can afford more than basic instruction." Margaret set down her fork, sudden anxiety gripping her stomach. "You want to send me away?" "Not away," Sarah said quickly. "The school is just in town. You could stay during the week and come home on weekends, or if you preferred, you could make the ride each day." "But why?" Margaret asked. "I'm learning here, I'm useful here." James leaned forward. "You are absolutely useful here, and this will always be your home. But Sarah and I want you to have every opportunity to become whatever you want to be. If you want to spend your whole life on the ranch, that's wonderful. But if you want to be a teacher or a businesswoman or anything else, you should have the education to make that choice." Margaret thought about this. The idea of formal schooling appealed to her, but she worried about what it might mean for her place on the ranch. "Would I still be part of the ranch operations?" "Of course," Sarah said. "Education should add to your life, not take away from it." Over the following weeks, Margaret rode into town twice to meet with Miss Walsh and observe her classes. The teacher was a woman in her 30s who had come to Texas after teaching in Philadelphia schools for several years. She was impressed with Margaret's existing education and excited about the challenge of working with such a motivated student. "Your penmanship is exceptional," Miss Walsh told her during their first meeting. "And your mathematical skills are quite advanced for someone your age. I think you would benefit tremendously from exposure to literature, advanced composition, and natural sciences." The school occupied a converted store building with room for about 15 students. The other pupils came from the more prosperous families in town: the banker's daughter, the doctor's twin sons, the children of successful merchants. Margaret worried about fitting in with students who had never experienced life in an orphanage or on an auction block. Her first day proved both challenging and encouraging. The academic work was more demanding than anything she had encountered, but she discovered that her practical education on the ranch had given her advantages the other students lacked. When Miss Walsh taught mathematics, Margaret could apply the concepts to real problems like calculating feed costs and measuring pasture area. Her experience managing ranch correspondence had given her a mature understanding of written communication that impressed both her teacher and classmates. Some of the students were curious about her background, asking questions about ranch life with genuine interest. Others seemed puzzled by her presence, unable to understand why someone would choose to live on a ranch when they could enjoy the comforts of town life. "Don't you get lonely out there with just cows and cowboys for company?" asked Elizabeth Morrison, the banker's daughter. Not at all, Margaret replied. There's always something happening on a ranch. Animals being born, storms to weather, problems to solve, and I have my family. But they're not really your family, are they? Elizabeth pressed. I heard you came from an orphanage. Margaret felt the familiar sting of being reminded of her origins, but she had learned to respond with confidence rather than shame. The Callahans are my family in every way that matters. They chose me, and I chose them. That's more than some people can say about their blood relatives. Miss Walsh, overhearing the exchange, smoothly redirected the conversation to the day's literature lesson. After class, she asked Margaret to stay behind. How are you finding the social aspects of school? She asked directly. It's different from what I'm used to, Margaret admitted. Some of the students don't understand that there are different ways to live and be happy. And how do you handle their questions about your background? Margaret thought for a moment. I try to remember that most of them are just curious, not mean. They've never had to question where they belong or whether they're wanted. In some ways, that makes them lucky. In other ways, maybe it makes them less understanding of people who are different. Miss Walsh smiled. That's a very mature perspective, and quite generous considering some of the comments I've overheard. Over the following months, Margaret settled into a routine that balanced her education with her responsibilities on the ranch. She attended school 4 days a week, spending long weekends at home helping with ranch operations. The arrangement worked well, allowing her to maintain her connection to the Double C while expanding her knowledge and skills. Her academic progress was remarkable. Miss Walsh regularly used Margaret's essays as examples for the other students, and her mathematical problem-solving abilities soon exceeded those of pupils who had been in formal education their entire lives. More importantly, she began to develop friendships with several of her classmates who appreciated her unique perspective and experiences. One afternoon in late November, Margaret was working on a composition about frontier life when a commotion outside interrupted the lesson. Through the schoolroom windows, she could see a crowd gathering around the sheriff's office across the street. Miss Walsh dismissed class early, and Margaret hurried outside to see what was happening. Sheriff Peterson was talking animatedly with several townspeople, including her former auctioneer, Jeremiah Hawks. Margaret caught fragments of their conversation, something about missing children and a wagon found abandoned outside of town. "Excuse me, Sheriff," she said, stepping forward. "What's happened?" Sheriff Peterson looked at her with recognition. "Aren't you the O'Sullivan girl who went to live with the Callahans?" "Yes, sir, Margaret Callahan now." "Well, we've got a situation that might concern you. A wagon carrying children from the Mercy home to an adoption placement up north was attacked by bandits 2 days ago. The driver was found dead, and 5 children are missing." Margaret felt her blood turn cold. Children from Mercy home. That's right, boys and girls aged 6 to 14. The wagon never reached its destination, and there's been no ransom demand. We're organizing search parties, but the trail's getting cold. Without hesitation, Margaret said, "I want to help search." Sheriff Peterson looked skeptical. "That's generous, miss, but this could be dangerous work. These bandits have already killed once." "I know how to track, I can ride as well as anyone, and I know how scared those children must be right now. Please let me help." Mr. Hawks, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "Sheriff, the girl's right about the tracking, and she knows what it's like to be one of those children. Might give us an edge in understanding where they'd be taken or how they'd try to escape." Margaret looked at the auctioneer with surprise. She had never expected support from him. Mr. Hawks seemed to read her thoughts. "I may run those auctions, miss, but I don't like to see children come to harm. If you can help find them, I'm all for it." The sheriff considered this. "I'd need permission from your parents." "Then let's go ask them," Margaret said immediately. The ride back to the ranch had never seemed longer. Margaret's mind raced with possibilities, each more frightening than the last. She remembered her own terror during the long journey from San Antonio to Silver Creek, the vulnerability of being completely dependent on adults whose intentions might not be honorable. James and Sarah listened to her explanation with growing concern. When she finished, James was quiet for a long moment. "This is dangerous, Margaret. These men have already shown they're willing to kill." "I know, but I also know what it feels like to be powerless and afraid. If I can help those children, I have to try." Sarah reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. What exactly would your role be in the search? Tracking mostly, reading sign that others might miss, and if we do find them, maybe helping to calm them down. They'll be terrified of any adult at this point. James and Sarah exchanged a long look, the kind of wordless communication Margaret had learned to recognize between couples who trusted each other completely. "All right," James said finally, "but with conditions. You stay with the main search party at all times. No heroics, no going off on your own. And at the first sign of real danger, you follow orders without question." Margaret nodded eagerly. "I promise." And Sarah added, "You take Miguel and Carlos with you. They're our best riders and most experienced hands. If the sheriff has a problem with that, he can take it up with us." As Margaret prepared for what might be the most important challenge of her young life, she reflected on how much had changed since that humiliating day on the auction block. Then, she had been powerless, unwanted, and without hope. Now she was part of a family that supported her dreams, a community that valued her contributions, and a search effort that might save lives. Tomorrow, she would put all her hard-earned skills to the test in service of children who were experiencing the same fear and abandonment she had once known. It was a chance to turn her painful past into something that could help others, and perhaps to discover just how strong she had become. Dawn was still an hour away when Margaret saddled her horse Dusty, a reliable chestnut mare with enough stamina for a long day's ride. Miguel and Carlos were already mounted and waiting, their rifles secured in saddle boots and supply packs loaded with food and medical supplies Sarah had insisted they carry. The three of them had ridden together many times during ranch operations, and Margaret felt confident in their partnership. Sheriff Peterson had assembled a search party of 12 men, divided into 3 groups that would cover different areas where the missing children might have been taken. Margaret's group included herself, Miguel, Carlos, Deputy Tom Nash, and 2 local ranchers named Wright and Collins who knew the hill country well. "Here's what we know," Sheriff Peterson briefed them in the pre-dawn darkness outside his office. "The wagon was attacked about 15 miles northeast of here, near Crow Creek. The bandits took everything of value, including the horses, but left the empty wagon. We found signs that the children were forced to walk east into the hills." He spread a rough map on a wooden crate. "That area is riddled with caves and hidden valleys, perfect place to hide captives or wait out pursuit. But it's also dangerous country, flash flood zones, loose rock, and at least 2 known hideouts used by outlaws over the years." Margaret studied the map carefully, noting the terrain features and water sources. Her months of wrangling across the Double C Ranch had taught her to read landscape like a book, understanding how geography influenced both human and animal movement. "Sheriff," she said, "if they're holding children, they'll need water and shelter, but they'll also want to stay mobile in case someone tracks them. That suggests they're not in the deep caves, but rather using them as temporary stops." Deputy Nash looked skeptical. "That's a lot of assumptions, miss." "It's not assumptions," Wright spoke up unexpectedly. "The girl's right. I've tracked rustlers through that country for 20 years. They use the caves for storage and emergency shelter, but never as permanent camps. Too easy to get trapped." Sheriff Peterson nodded approvingly. "That matches what I was thinking. We'll search the creek beds and valley approaches first. If they're moving the children regularly, we should pick up fresh signs." As the first gray light appeared in the east, the 3 search groups rode out in different directions. Margaret's group headed northeast toward the area where the wagon had been found, following a trail that wound through increasingly rough terrain. The attack site was clearly marked by broken wagon pieces and disturbed earth where the sheriff's initial investigation had taken place. Margaret dismounted and began walking in slow circles around the area, reading the story written in tracks and scattered objects. "5 children for certain," she said after several minutes of careful examination. 3 girls and 2 boys based on shoe sizes. The smallest child is probably 6 or 7 years old, wearing boots that are too big. The oldest might be 13 or 14. Miguel watched her work with admiration. "How can you tell about the boots?" "Look here," Margaret pointed to a clear footprint in a patch of mud. "See how the heel impression is deeper than the toe? That means the boot is loose and the child is having trouble keeping it on. Also, the stride length is shorter than it should be for the foot size." She continued her circuit, building a more complete picture. "They were held here for maybe 2 hours. See where the grass is flattened in that shaded spot? That's where they sat. The bandits let them rest and probably gave them water. Why would they bother with that? Collins asked. Because they need the children healthy enough to travel, Margaret said grimly. Dead or injured captives are worthless, whether you're planning to ransom them or sell them. The possibility that the children might be destined for sale rather than ransom had been discussed quietly among the adults, but Margaret was the first to voice it directly. The illegal trade in children for labor or worse purposes was a reality on the frontier, though respectable people rarely spoke of it openly. Deputy Nash studied the tracks leading away from the site. Trail heads east like the sheriff said, but it splits about a quarter-mile up. Looks like they divided the group. This was troubling news. Tracking one group would be challenging enough. Following multiple trails simultaneously would require dividing their already small search party or risking losing one set of captives while pursuing another. Let's follow both trails for a short distance, Margaret suggested. Maybe we can tell which group has more children or where they might be headed. They spent the next hour carefully examining both sets of tracks. The northern trail showed signs of 3 children and at least 2 adults, while the southern trail indicated 2 children with 1 adult. Both trails headed into the roughest part of the hill country. We need to make a choice, Deputy Nash said. We can't cover both trails effectively with 6 people. Margaret was studying the southern trail when something caught her attention. Caught on a thorny bush about 4 feet off the ground was a small piece of blue fabric. She examined it carefully, noting its quality and color. This came from a dress, she said. Good fabric but not fancy, the kind the Mercy Home would provide for travel. More importantly, the fabric was caught at a height that suggested someone had deliberately placed it there rather than snagging it accidentally while walking. Margaret's heart began to beat faster. One of the children left this as a marker, she said with growing excitement. See how it's positioned? It's too high to be an accident, but placed perfectly to catch sunlight and be visible from a distance. Carlos nodded thoughtfully. Smart kid, trying to leave a trail for rescuers. If one child is smart enough to leave markers, they might leave more, Margaret continued. And if they're thinking about rescue, it means they haven't given up hope. We should follow this trail. Deputy Nash looked uncertain. That's a lot to conclude from one piece of cloth. Maybe, Margaret admitted, but I know what it's like to be those children right now. If I were being forced to walk through unfamiliar country, I would try to leave signs for anyone looking for me, especially if I had younger children with me to protect. The conviction in her voice seemed to sway the group. They followed the southern trail into increasingly challenging terrain, with Margaret and Miguel taking turns dismounting to read sign when the trail became difficult to follow from horseback. As the morning progressed, Margaret's theory proved correct. They found 2 more fabric markers, a strip of petticoat lace tied to a branch at eye level, and a small piece of shirt material wedged between rocks in a way that would catch the attention of anyone looking carefully. This kid is good, Wright commented as Margaret pointed out the 3rd marker, making sure we can follow without making it obvious to the captors. Smart and brave, Margaret said with deep admiration for the unknown child who was risking punishment to help potential rescuers. Around midday, they reached an area where the trail disappeared entirely onto a stretch of bare rock that retained no footprints. This was a common tactic used by outlaws to throw off pursuit, but it presented a serious challenge for the search party. They could have gone in any direction from here, Deputy Nash said with frustration. We might have to go back and try the other trail. Margaret dismounted and began walking the perimeter of the rock formation, looking for any sign of where the group might have descended back onto trackable ground. The area was roughly circular, about 100 yards across, with several possible exit points. She was about to give up when a glint of metal caught her eye. Wedged into a crack in the rock was a small brass button that appeared to have been placed deliberately rather than lost accidentally. Here, she called to the others. They went this way. The trail beyond the rock formation was clearer, leading down into a narrow valley with a seasonal creek running through it. The landscape was beautiful but isolated, exactly the kind of place where captives could be held without fear of discovery by casual travelers. As they descended into the valley, Margaret began to feel a growing sense of urgency. The tracks were becoming fresher, and she could see signs that the group had moved through this area within the past few hours. They were getting close. Miguel raised his hand suddenly, signaling for silence. In the distance, barely audible over the sound of wind through the trees, came the sound of voices. Adult voices, rough and argumentative. The search party dismounted and secured their horses before moving forward on foot. Deputy Nash took the lead, with his rifle ready, while Margaret and the others spread out to cover more ground without making noise. As they crept through the trees toward the source of the voices, Margaret caught sight of a small campsite in a clearing ahead. Two men were arguing over a bottle while a third sat nearby cleaning his rifle. At first, she didn't see any children. Then movement near the far edge of the clearing caught her attention. Two small figures were huddled together under a large tree, partially hidden by shadows, but clearly visible to Margaret's sharp eyes. They appeared to be a boy and girl, both wearing the simple traveling clothes provided by orphanages. Where were the other three children? Margaret scanned the area carefully but saw no signs of additional captives. Either her group had followed the wrong trail, or the children had been split up even further. Deputy Nash was making hand signals, indicating that he wanted Miguel and Carlos to circle around to the far side of the clearing while he approached from the front. Margaret was instructed to stay back and be ready to comfort the children once the bandits were captured. But as the men began to move into position, Margaret noticed something that filled her with alarm. One of the bandits was getting up from his position and walking toward the tree where the children were hidden. His intention was unclear, but his body language suggested aggression or impatience. Margaret made a quick decision that went against her promise to follow orders. She couldn't wait for the deputy's carefully planned approach if one of the children was about to be hurt. Moving as quietly as possible, she began working her way around the edge of the clearing toward the children. She was halfway there when the bandit reached the tree and grabbed the older child, the boy, by his shirt, hauling him to his feet. Margaret could see the terror on both children's faces and knew she had to act immediately. "You little rats have been nothing but trouble," the man snarled, loud enough for Margaret to hear clearly. "Maybe it's time to leave one of you behind to send a message to anyone following us." Without thinking about her own safety, Margaret stepped out of concealment. "Let him go," she said in the steadiest voice she could manage. The bandit spun around in surprise, still gripping the boy's shirt. "What the hell? Where did you come from, girl?" "I said let him go. You're surrounded by armed men, so you might want to think about surrendering peacefully." It was a bluff. The other members of her search party weren't in position yet, and Margaret was completely alone. But she was counting on the bandit's surprise and uncertainty to buy her time. The man looked around nervously, trying to spot the armed men Margaret had mentioned. His grip on the boy loosened slightly. "I don't see nobody," he said after a moment, but his voice held less conviction than before. "That's because they're good at their job," Margaret replied, taking a small step closer. "Just like I'm good at mine. I tracked you here from the wagon site, reading every sign you left. Did you really think you could take children from Texas without someone coming after them?" The boy in the bandit's grasp caught Margaret's eye and gave her a barely perceptible nod, as if to say he understood she was trying to help. The younger child, a girl of maybe 7, remained huddled against the tree, but was watching the confrontation with wide, hopeful eyes. Margaret realized with a start that these might be the same children she had seen months earlier at other orphan auctions. The frontier communities were small enough that children often went through multiple placements before finding permanent homes, and their faces seemed familiar. "Are you Margaret?" the boy whispered suddenly, causing the bandit to tighten his grip again. "Shut up, kid," the man snarled, but his attention was divided now between Margaret and his captive. Margaret's heart leaped. Somehow this boy knew who she was, but how? "Yes," she said simply. "I'm Margaret Callahan, and I'm here to take you home." The boy's face brightened with relief and hope. "Sarah told us to watch for a girl with red hair who knew about tracking. She said if we ever got in trouble, you would find us." Margaret felt a shock of recognition. Sarah, this had to be one of the children from the Mercy home who had been placed with families but had run into trouble. Sarah sometimes corresponded with the nuns, checking on children who had been adopted in the area. But there was no time to work out the details. The bandit was becoming more agitated, looking around frantically for the armed men Margaret had claimed were surrounding him. "I don't know what game you're playing, girl, but you just made a big mistake showing yourself. Now I got 3 hostages instead of 2. He reached for a pistol at his belt with his free hand, still maintaining his grip on the boy with the other. Margaret realized her bluff had failed and that she might have made the situation worse instead of better. That was when Deputy Nash's voice rang out from the trees behind the bandits' camp. "Drop your weapons, you're surrounded." The clearing erupted into chaos. The two bandits who had been drinking scrambled for their rifles, while the one holding the boy spun around trying to locate the source of the voice. Margaret threw herself forward, grabbing the little girl and pulling her behind the large tree for protection. "Stay down and don't move," she whispered urgently to the child, who nodded with the quick understanding that comes from surviving dangerous situations. Gunfire erupted as the bandits opened fire on the trees where they thought the deputy was hidden. Margaret could hear Miguel and Carlos calling out positions as they moved to flank the camp from different angles. But the bandit holding the boy was using him as a human shield, backing toward the far edge of the clearing. Margaret knew she had seconds to act before the man disappeared into the trees with his captive. Without thinking about the risk, she picked up a fallen branch and threw it as hard as she could, aiming not for the bandit but for a point just behind him. The stick crashed through the underbrush, creating enough noise and distraction for the boy to break free of his captor's loosened grip. He dove toward Margaret's position behind the tree just as Deputy Nash and the others rushed the camp from 3 directions. The fight was over quickly. 2 of the bandits surrendered immediately when they realized they were outnumbered and outgunned. The third tried to run, but was tackled by Wright before he could reach cover. As the men secured the prisoners, Margaret focused on the 2 children who were now clinging to her with desperate relief. The boy appeared to be about 11 years old, with dark hair and serious brown eyes that held too much knowledge of hardship. The girl was younger and smaller, with tangled blonde hair and a dress that had once been blue but was now dirty and torn. "Are you hurt?" Margaret asked them gently. "Did they do anything to you?" "We're okay," the boy said, speaking for both of them. "They mostly just made us walk and didn't give us much food, but they kept talking about taking us somewhere to sell us." Margaret felt sick at the confirmation of what everyone had feared. "What are your names?" "I'm David and this is Lucy. We were being taken to a family in Austin, but the wagon got attacked the first night." "Where are the other children? There were supposed to be 5 of you." David's face fell. "They split us up yesterday, took Annie, Ben, and little Tom with them toward the big mountains, said it was safer to travel in smaller groups." Margaret felt a mixture of relief and renewed urgency. She had found 2 of the children, but 3 more were still in danger somewhere in the wilderness. And if the bandits' plan had been to sell them, time was running out. Deputy Nash finished securing the prisoners and approached Margaret's group. "Are the young ones all right?" "Physically, yes," Margaret replied. "But there are 3 more children still missing. The group was split up yesterday." The deputy questioned the captured bandits, but they claimed not to know where their partners had taken the other children. Whether this was true or simply their attempt to protect their associates was impossible to determine. "We need to get word to the other search parties," Deputy Nash decided, "and we need to get these children somewhere safe while we continue looking." Margaret looked at David and Lucy, who were still staying close to her side despite the presence of the adult rescuers. She remembered her own experience of being afraid of all adults except those she knew she could trust. "I'll stay with them," she said. "They know me now and they're scared. I can help with the search for the others too." As the group prepared to escort the captured bandits back to town and continue the search for the remaining children, Margaret reflected on how much her life had changed since that day on the auction block. Then, she had been the one needing rescue, powerless and afraid. Now, she was the one providing comfort and hope to children facing the same terrors she had once known. The search wasn't over yet. 3 children were still out there, depending on rescue that might or might not come in time. But Margaret had learned an important lesson about herself during this day. She was no longer the frightened girl who had once sobbed that nobody wanted her. She had become someone who could face danger to protect others, someone whose skills and determination made a difference when it mattered most. And she had also learned something about the bonds that connected all the unwanted children scattered across the frontier. Whether they shared blood or not, whether they had met before or not, they were family in their shared experience of loss and hope. David and Lucy had known to look for her because word of her success had somehow reached them, giving them faith that rescue would come. As they rode back toward town with their rescued children and captured criminals, Margaret was already planning the next phase of the search. 3 more children were counting on her skills, and she would not let them down. The town of Silver Creek had transformed into a hub of organized activity by the time Margaret's group returned with David, Lucy, and the 3 captured bandits. Word of the successful rescue had spread quickly, and several more volunteers had joined the search efforts. Sheriff Peterson had set up a command center in his office, where maps covered every available surface and runners carried messages between the various search teams. David and Lucy were immediately taken to Doc Martinez for examination, though they appeared to be in better condition than anyone had dared hope. Margaret stayed with them during the medical check, providing the comfort of a familiar face as the doctor confirmed they were undernourished and exhausted, but otherwise unharmed. "The boys got good instincts," Doc Martinez told Margaret privately. "He kept the little girl calm and made sure she ate what food they were given, probably saved her life." Margaret wasn't surprised. In her experience, children who had survived the orphanage system developed protective instincts and leadership abilities far beyond their years. David had clearly taken responsibility for Lucy's welfare, just as Margaret had once looked out for younger children at Mercy Home. While the children rested with hot food and clean clothes provided by the church ladies, Margaret joined the strategy meeting in the sheriff's office. The 3 captured bandits had finally been convinced to provide information about their partners, partly through Sheriff Peterson's interrogation skills, and partly through their own fear of being charged with murder in addition to kidnapping. "They're headed for a trading post called Broken Wheel, about 40 miles north of here," Deputy Nash reported. "It's run by a man named Jake Morrison who apparently deals in more than just supplies and horses." Margaret had never heard of Broken Wheel, but several of the older ranchers knew the location. It was situated in a remote area where 3 cattle trails converged, making it a natural stopping point for travelers who wanted to avoid questions about their business or cargo. "Morrison's been suspected of fencing stolen goods for years," said Tom Wright. "Never been able to prove it, but honest folks don't generally use his place." Sheriff Peterson studied the map spread across his desk. "If they're planning to sell those children, they'll want to complete the transaction quickly. Every hour they hold them increases the risk of getting caught." Margaret felt a chill of urgency. The 3 missing children, Annie, Ben, and little Tom, were probably being taken to buyers who had already been contacted. Once they were handed over, finding them would become nearly impossible. "How long would it take them to reach this trading post?" she asked. "On foot, driving children, at least 2 days from where we found you," replied Collins. "But they've got a day's head start." Margaret did quick calculations in her head. "So they could be there by tomorrow evening. How long would it take us to reach Broken Wheel?" "Hard riding, we could make it by late tomorrow," Sheriff Peterson said. "But that's pushing our horses pretty hard, and we'd arrive exhausted." "What if we split up again?" Margaret suggested. "Send a fast group ahead to watch the trading post and bring a larger group for backup." The adults in the room looked at her with varying degrees of approval and concern. Margaret had proven her tracking abilities and courage, but what she was suggesting would put her in the middle of a potentially dangerous confrontation. "Margaret," Sheriff Peterson said carefully, "you've done more than anyone could have asked already. Maybe it's time to let the adults handle this." "With respect, Sheriff, I'm the only one here who knows what those children are going through right now. I can read their signs better than anyone, and they'll trust me faster than they'll trust strangers with guns." James Callahan, who had ridden into town when he heard about the rescue, stepped forward. "She's right about understanding the children, and she's proven she can handle herself in dangerous situations." "But this could turn into a running gun battle," Deputy Nash protested. "That's no place for a young lady." Margaret felt her temper flare at the familiar dismissal of her capabilities. "Mr. Nash, I helped capture 3 armed bandits this morning while you were still getting into position. I think I've earned the right to finish what I started." Sarah Callahan, who had come to town with James, spoke up unexpectedly. "Margaret should go, but not because she's proven herself in a fight, because those children need someone who understands what they're feeling and why they might be afraid of all adults, even rescuers." This perspective seemed to sway several of the men who had been uncertain about including Margaret in the more dangerous phase of the operation. Sheriff Peterson made his decision. "All right, We'll form two groups. Margaret, myself, Miguel, and Carlos will ride ahead to scout the trading post and locate the children if possible. Deputy Nash will follow 6 hours behind us with a larger group in case we need backup or things go wrong. As the groups prepared to leave, Margaret took a few minutes to speak privately with David and Lucy. They were staying in town under the protection of the church, but she wanted them to know that their ordeal was almost over. "We're going to find the others," she promised them. "Annie, Ben, and Tom are going to be all right." David looked at her with the serious expression that seemed permanently etched on his face. "Margaret, you need to know something about Tom. He's only 6 and he's been sick. That's why they split us up. They were afraid he was slowing them down too much." Margaret's heart sank. A 6-year-old being forced to travel at adult pace through rough country was in serious danger, even without the threat posed by his captors. "What kind of sick?" she asked. "Fever and cough. He was getting worse each day. Annie was trying to take care of him, but she's only 9 herself." This information added another layer of urgency to the rescue mission. If little Tom was seriously ill, he might not survive much longer without proper medical care. Margaret's group left Silver Creek as the sun was setting, riding hard toward the north. They planned to travel through the night, resting the horses only when absolutely necessary. The country between Silver Creek and Broken Wheel was mostly open range with scattered settlements, allowing them to maintain a good pace. As they rode, Margaret found herself thinking about the chain of events that had brought her to this point. A year ago, she had been a frightened, unwanted child with no control over her own fate. Now she was part of a rescue mission that might save 3 children from a terrible destiny. The transformation wasn't just about finding a loving family, though James and Sarah's acceptance had certainly provided the foundation. It was also about discovering her own capabilities and developing the confidence to use them when others needed help. Around midnight, they stopped to rest the horses and eat a quick meal of bread and dried meat. The night was cold but clear, with enough starlight to follow the trail they were using. "How much farther?" Margaret asked Miguel, who had traveled this route before during cattle drives. "Maybe 15 miles. We should reach the area around dawn." "And then?" Sheriff Peterson answered that question. "We scout carefully before doing anything. Morrison's trading post is built like a fort, stone walls, limited access, good fields of fire. If those children are there, getting them out won't be easy." Margaret understood the tactical challenges, but she was already thinking about other aspects of the problem. If Morrison deals with people who buy children, he probably has secure places to keep them hidden. Underground storage, back rooms, maybe even separate buildings. "That's a grim thought," Carlos said quietly. "But a realistic one. We need to be prepared for the possibility that the children won't be visible even if we find the right place." As dawn approached, they could see smoke rising from cooking fires ahead. Broken Wheel Trading Post was built in a natural depression between 2 hills, with the main building constructed of local stone and timber. Several smaller structures surrounded it, including what appeared to be a stable, storage sheds, and living quarters. The group dismounted and hobbled their horses in a grove of trees about half a mile from the trading post. Moving on foot, they worked their way to positions where they could observe the compound without being seen. What they saw was not encouraging. The trading post was indeed built like a fortress, with high walls and narrow windows that would make any direct assault extremely costly. Several men were visible moving around the compound, and they appeared to be well armed and alert. "There," Margaret whispered, pointing to one of the smaller buildings. "Someone just carried food to that shed behind the stable, food for more people than I can see walking around." Sheriff Peterson studied the building through a small telescope. "You might be right. That building has no windows and only one door, perfect for holding prisoners." They watched for 2 hours, learning the patterns of movement around the compound. Margaret counted at least 6 men, all armed, all moving with the purposeful efficiency of people engaged in serious business. Just before noon, their patience was rewarded. A man emerged from the suspected prison building carrying a bucket, probably waste being disposed of. More importantly, Margaret caught a brief glimpse of someone small moving inside the building before the door closed again. "Children," she said with certainty. "At least one, maybe more." "Now we know where they are," Sheriff Peterson said. "The question is how to get them out." Margaret studied the layout of the compound, looking for any weakness or opportunity. The building where the children were being held was relatively close to the back wall of the compound, and there appeared to be a blind spot in the guards' coverage near the stable. "What if we create a distraction?" she suggested. "Something that draws the guards to the front of the compound while someone slips in the back." "Too risky," Miguel said immediately. "You'll be trapped if things go wrong." "Not if we time it right, and not if I'm the one who goes in." Sheriff Peterson looked at her sharply. "Absolutely not. I'm not sending a 15-year-old girl into that compound alone." "I'm 13, Margaret corrected automatically. "And I'm the logical choice. I'm small enough to move without being seen, the children will trust me immediately, and I can calm them down if they're scared or sick." "It's too dangerous," the sheriff insisted. Margaret felt her frustration building. Even after proving herself repeatedly, she still had to fight for the right to take necessary risks. "Sheriff, with respect, what's your alternative? Wait for Deputy Nash's group to arrive and try to storm the place. How many people die in that scenario? Guards, rescuers, maybe the children themselves." Sheriff Peterson was quiet for a long moment, considering the options. Margaret could see him struggling between his protective instincts and his recognition that she might be right about the tactical situation. "If we do this," he said finally, "it has to be planned perfectly. One mistake and people die." They spent the next hour developing a detailed plan. Miguel and Carlos would create a distraction by approaching the front of the trading post openly, pretending to be travelers looking for supplies and information about cattle prices. While the guards were focused on them, Margaret would slip over the back wall and attempt to reach the children. Sheriff Peterson would remain in position to provide covering fire if the plan went wrong, and Margaret needed to escape quickly. The signal for abort would be 3 quick rifle shots, which would tell Margaret to forget the children and save herself. "Remember," Sheriff Peterson emphasized, "your job is to find the children and get them ready to move. Don't try to be a hero. We'll handle the guards if it comes to fighting." Margaret nodded her understanding, though privately she knew that circumstances might force her to make decisions that went beyond the carefully laid plan. As afternoon faded toward evening, they moved into position. Miguel and Carlos circled around to approach the trading post from the expected direction, while Margaret worked her way to the back wall. Sheriff Peterson found a concealed position with clear sight lines to both the compound entrance and the building where the children were being held. When she reached the back wall, Margaret was relieved to find it was lower than it had appeared from a distance, perhaps 8 feet high, and built of stacked stone without mortar in several places. She found a section where missing stones created handholds and waited for the signal to begin. The sound of voices drifted from the front of the compound as Miguel and Carlos announced their arrival. Margaret could hear Jake Morrison himself responding, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a man who specialized in shady dealings. "Afternoon, gentlemen. What brings you to Broken Wheel?" "Looking for supplies and information," Miguel replied in the slightly stupid drawl he used when he wanted people to underestimate him. "Been driving cattle up from South Texas and heard you might know about buyers in this area." Margaret used the cover of their conversation to scale the wall and drop quietly into the compound. The back area was cluttered with crates, barrels, and equipment, providing excellent concealment as she moved toward the suspected prison building. As she got closer, she could hear faint sounds from inside, muffled voices, shuffling movements, and what sounded like someone crying softly. Her heart ached for the children inside, who had probably given up hope of rescue by now. The building's single door was secured with a heavy wooden bar, but Margaret noticed that one of the lower boards in the wall was loose. Working carefully, she managed to create a gap just large enough to squeeze through. Inside, the building was dark except for thin beams of light filtering through gaps in the walls. As her eyes adjusted, Margaret could make out 3 small figures huddled together on a pile of old blankets in the corner. "Annie, Ben, Tom," she whispered softly. 3 faces turned toward her voice, eyes wide with fear and confusion. "I'm Margaret Callahan," she said, keeping her voice calm and reassuring. "I'm here to take you home. David and Lucy sent me." The oldest child, a girl with brown braids who must be Annie, stared at Margaret with desperate hope. "Are you really here?" she whispered. "We thought nobody was coming." Margaret moved closer, noting that little Tom appeared to be unconscious or sleeping deeply in Annie's arms. His face was flushed with fever, and his breathing seemed labored. "I'm really here," Margaret assured them. "And we're going to get you out, but I need you to be very quiet and do exactly what I tell you. Can you do that?" Ben, who appeared to be about 8 years old, nodded eagerly. Annie looked uncertain but hopeful. "Tom is really sick," Annie whispered. "He hasn't eaten anything today, and he's been having bad dreams." Margaret gently touched the little boy's forehead and felt the heat of serious fever. He needed medical attention immediately, but first they had to get him away from his captors. From outside, she could still hear Miguel's conversation with Morrison and the trading post staff. So far, the distraction was working perfectly, but Margaret knew they had only minutes before someone might check on the prisoners. "We're going to leave through the wall just like I came in," she told Annie and Ben. "I'll carry Tom, and you two stay right behind me. If anything goes wrong, you hide and don't come out until you hear me call your names. Understand?" Both children nodded solemnly. Margaret lifted Tom gently, trying not to wake him, and maneuvered back through the gap in the wall. Annie and Ben followed immediately, moving with the quick obedience of children who had learned that their survival depended on following instructions without question. Once all four of them were outside the building, Margaret paused to check the compound. The voices from the front were continuing their casual conversation, and she could see no guards in the back area. Moving as quickly as possible while carrying the sick child, Margaret led Annie and Ben toward the back wall.